thank you for having me. This is my first ever time to UCC, and so it's very good to be here on this very damp Irish evening. Thank you to the Fianna Fáil Society, to the Europa Society, and to the International Relations Society for organising this. I followed the organisation on Twitter. You did a very good job. And thank you to you brave souls for coming in this weather. I could barely make it from my car in the door. I hope that you didn't get too wet coming here. A federal Europe. This is fast becoming one of the most pertinent and relevant questions of our time. In the introduction, we talked about the fact that I had called for a no vote to the Lisbon Treaty, both Lisbon I and Lisbon II, and most recently in the Fiscal Compact Treaty. The reason that I did that was because I am a committed federalist, and because if you are a committed federalist, you're obviously going to look at Europe in a way that if you like, draws from your own experiences through life, business, whatever it is that you've done, and applies them to the challenge as you see it. And the challenge that I saw across Europe was that the European Union in its current form was headed in the wrong direction. I'll give you a bit of background to why I read the Lisbon Treaty in the first place. It was called the European Constitution then. I actually ended up hosting a forum to debate it in 2004. But before I did that, I read it. And I read it in the early draft form before it was ever formally published anywhere. But I was reading early drafts. And I was very alarmed at what I was seeing. I had, at that time, an idea to look at rolling out a pan-European business in the energy sector. I'd already done so with a company called Broadnet, which I subsequently ended up selling to an American company called Comcast. But I rolled Broadnet out in one licenses across 10 countries across Europe, including Germany, where we built out the top 42 cities, Spain, France, and various other countries. And so seeing the opportunities that Europe offered to me as an entrepreneur, it is, for a whole lot of reasons, that being one, a very exciting place to be able to operate. And I looked at the power sector and I thought, the barriers to competition are going to come down. There is going to be a true free market here, and now that there's discussion of establishing a European constitution, I'm going to read this thing because I want to be able to be a little bit ahead of the curve and know what's coming down the track, so I can prepare for it as an entrepreneur and to be able to exploit the opportunities that this change was going to bring about, because that's what entrepreneurs try to do. And in reading it, I was alarmed. And I was alarmed because not only was it not going to provide for those types of opportunities, not only was there nothing in the Lisbon Treaty that made it clear that those sorts of opportunities would be available, but on the contrary, it seemed to be establishing a form of governance in the European Union that was utterly detached from any accountability in the sense that we generally know it in democracies, and it was creating this new thing, dissolving the European communities that had existed since the time of the Treaty of Rome, and creating this new entity that was not going to be democratically accountable. It was something else. And federalism is not anything like what we have in today's European structures. My experience of learning about federalism was reading about it in the context of the American experiment. And if you haven't read the Federalist Papers, I would strongly recommend that you do it, because even the word federalism is misunderstood in large parts of Europe, particularly in the British media and to some degree in the Irish media. It is not, it is misunderstood. Federalism does not mean all power to the centre and a distancing of government from the people. It means something very different. It means, essentially, bottom-up control, bottom-up democracy, really government by the people, for the people. And the American experiment was the first modern experiment, if I can call it modern, with the idea of federalism and the idea of republic for a very long time. I think it was Franklin when he walked out and somebody asked him after the first deliberations over what form of government America would have. She said, well, what do we have? And he said, he's a republic or a monarchy. And he said, a republic, madam, for as long as you can keep it. And these things are delicate. He understood, Franklin understood, and the founders of America understood that this was a very delicate thing, and it could have collapsed straight away, very early on. In fact, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, and a very important contributor to the Federalist Papers, helped save the Union very early on by federalising the debts of all of the 13 colonies and member states, or states as they had then become, and saving the nascent Union from collapsing, spinning apart, with lots of states falling into bankruptcy. And so there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from the American experiment and applied to some degree to what we're trying to do in Europe now. Of course, and some of you will have heard me say this before, I think it would be outrageously unreasonable not to recognise that this European Union has been one of the most successful peace processes in the history of the world. Now, did I think it should have been given the Nobel Peace Prize? No. Not because I don't think the European Union hasn't been one of the most successful, if not the most successful peace process in the history of the world, but because I think it's actually even bigger than the Nobel Peace Prize. We don't go around giving prizes to Mount Everest for being the tallest mountain. Some things are just self-evident. And it is self-evident that the European Union has made a massive contribution to peace and to stop us from slaughtering each other on this continent, something that we're getting ever more efficient at doing, and efficient in certainly the wrong sense of the word, over the course of the last several hundred years. And so I think that we're faced now with a choice of whether or not we see this thing through, this thing that started at the end of the Second World War, actually even before, at the end of the First World War, when you had Monet and others trying to bring about European Union, and then you had an aberration of that in the effort under Nazi Germany to unify Europe under the jackboot, in the way that sometime earlier you had had the effort to unify Europe under Napoleon Bonaparte. So here for the third time in the modern era, we have an effort to bring the peoples of Europe together. An effort that I think is rooted in every right and proper value, and I think that needs to succeed. And I think that if it does not succeed, if it becomes unglued, I think you have a releasing of centrifugal forces that are unpredictable, but that if you were to look back at the pattern of history and graph it over the course of the last 500 years in Europe, it is not reasonable to assume that Europe will remain peaceful and stable if it becomes unglued. I think that is a most unrealistic prospect. Might it happen? Maybe. Are modern communications and the breaking down of barriers and travel and everything else, are those the things that ensure the peace? They certainly make a major contribution. But I still think that the core glue that holds us together are the apparatus, instruments, and institutions of a civilization and society that ensure that we all act in generally a collective interest. And we do that best by empowering individuals to perform at their very best. Those individuals right across all of the European Union. So, what would the federal Europe that I imagine at the moment, what would it look like? Well, first of all, it's not a threat to anybody's national identity. It's not a threat to me as an Irishman. I am very comfortable in my Irish identity, and I'm very comfortable in my Irish identity speaking to you up here with a North London accent. I'm perfectly comfortable with it. I know who I am, I know where I'm from, and I know where my roots are. A federal Europe is not going to change the fact that I'm an Irishman. My mother got me a Christmas present a few years ago. It's for a lab in California, and you send a saliva sample off, and they check your DNA, and they keep sending you emails as they just get, as the sample pool grows, they gather in more and more data. And I got an email from them, it must be maybe 8 or 9 months ago now, telling me that my paternal Palpo group, that's father, all the way back, has been in the East Galway, Roscommon area for at least 4,000 years. Now that's very worrying, and I'm glad that we get out and see people other than relatives these days. But that's not going to change. I know where I'm from, and yet my kids are the product of someone like that from Ireland, and my wife, who's a New Yorker of Italian and Polish heritage. I had 2 great-granduncles killed in the First World War in one of the Irish regiments of the British Army, in the trenches. My wife's grandfather, my children's great-grandfather, wore the uniform of the Austrian army in the First World War, was taken prisoner, and after the war went back to Poland. It looks like he fought the Russians in that brief spell, and then went over to America and settled down. So my kids are as European as it gets. They're a mixture of everything. And the change that we need to see is to make Europe relevant, not just to informed people like you here in this room, because you're interested enough to come here and want to hear about and engage in a debate about this. But people that haven't got time for this stuff, that have got, families to rear, jobs to do, whatever it is, they're getting on with the business of life. And they can't get into the nitty-gritty detail, but they trust people like you to figure this out and get it right. And so it's incumbent upon us to really think hard about this stuff, never to get sucked into a group that think, and to tell the current establishment what we think they want to hear. I don't think there's any danger of any of you in here doing that, but we must not fall into a groupthink trap. And that has been a big problem in Ireland's elite establishment. That groupthink about Europe has been something that afflicted us for quite a long time. And one of the biggest problems with Irish groupthink on Europe was that it ended up deferring to people outside of Ireland, where we thought somebody out there knows better than us. And that's how we ended up doing things like guaranteeing debt that was never ours to begin with, and continuing to pay Fáil private bondholders money that we never borrowed. This is the result of failed, literally bankrupt groupthink. And it's doing nothing to help Europe, it's doing nothing to promote growth in Europe, and to create the kind of turnaround in Europe that we need to create leadership. Because as a European, I would be quite bold. I think that Europe is capable of a new renaissance. I think Europe has the potential to be able to lead the world by example in this century, the one that we are now in. I think this can be the European century. This is an extremely exciting time. Imagine being in America in the 1780s or 1790s at the birth of this new thing that they were building. We're at that time now here in Europe. So what should this federal Europe look like? How do you create the events that will draw the attention of those people I talked about that are out there getting on with daily life so that they can start thinking about how it's relevant to them, listen to the debates, and get drawn into the spectator sport that is politics? Because Europe lacks politics. There is no European politic, and without a European politic, there will never be a European demos, because people won't be watching the same things. So what do you pick? What do you do? I've thought about this a lot, but I'll summarise. What needs to be done soon is to combine the roles of the presidency of the Commission, currently occupied by Barroso, and the presidency of the Council, currently occupied by Van Rompuy. Neither of them have any real democratic mandate, and to claim that they do is so many times removed, and it ends up being much further away from democracy than the Tesco's beef burger is from beef. I think I ate one of those in the last 6 months, by the way. So, many stages further away from democracy. Those roles should be merged into one presidency, and that presidency should have to run for election right across the European Union. So imagine this. Imagine in 3-4 years' time, you've got, and it's whittled down, so you have primaries, etc., and runoffs, and you end up with 2 finalists, if you like, in the contest to be the elected president of Europe. And you would have to have an electoral college system, by the way, because you couldn't have a situation where votes from Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus were irrelevant, and it was just going to be Germany, Italy, the UK, and France that were going to decide. And electoral colleges, a topic of much debate all the time, but they do work. It does mean that a state, some of the smaller states, are still able to be relevant and make a difference. In that context, that presidential election, you would have candidates competing for the currency of votes and having to appeal to voters right across all of the European Union. So they wouldn't be able to pander to olive growers in Sardinia or the fishermen in Donegal or the industrial workers exclusively in the Ruhr Valley or anything like that. They would have to really provide serious answers and serious vision for where Europe is going to go. They would have to display real leadership, because I expect that is what voters in Europe would respond to in such a situation. A contest like that is going to grab the attention of the people who otherwise don't have time to start thinking about the relevance of Europe to their lives. Most people don't understand that almost every regulation that affects us now, the majority of laws that are legislated for and passed through our Parliament, through Dáil Éireann, are initiated now from Brussels. Most people still don't realise that to be able to initiate legislation and law in Europe, you still have to be unelected. Only the Commission can do that. Now there is discussion right now about changing that. That's a very good and positive thing. The Parliament must have the power to initiate. The Commission needs to be brought under control in terms of democratic legitimacy. Now, that presidential position that I talked about, making that elected, you make that the president of Europe. The Commission would answer to that president, and I would be perfectly okay with the idea of the president appointing that commission, because that president, she or he, would be accountable to us, the voters. And so you would have a cabinet picked with the correct number of competencies. It's not that we need to have in that situation, a commissioner for every member state, because at that point we don't, and I'll talk about the other changes that will transfer. So you don't have to create sort of makey-uppy departments. You would have a limited number of departments dealing with a limited number of competencies that would be vested at that level. And the commission is now accountable and can be hired or fired by somebody that can be hired or fired by you. You give the exclusive right of legislative initiative to the Parliament, and you create two houses, an upper and lower house. And where we take care of the issue of the member states' concerns is in that place. Not at the commission level, but at the parliamentary level. The upper house would have a right of veto on any legislation, as would the lower house. The upper house would consist of an equal number of seats, pick a number, but an equal number of seats for every single member state. So Malta would have the same number of senators as Germany, etc., etc. The lower house, on the other hand, would be reflective of population, because Germany, France, they do get shortchanged in the European Parliament. They don't have the correct balance of MEPs to the ratio of population. The reason that is the case, and it's not right, but the reason that is the case is because we were trying to be able to, if you like, control Germany's and France's influence from being too powerful in the European Parliament, because our structures weren't set up properly. Once you do this, once you have an upper house where the senators from the member states have a right of veto, if you like, or collectively they have a right of veto over legislation, then you can have population-based representation in the lower house of Parliament, with the right to initiate legislation that can be vetoed by the upper house and vice versa, or by the presidency. So you have a good system of checks and balances. We already have an ECJ, we already have a decent body of law, of European law, we already have a form of constitution in the Lisbon Treaty, which really is a constitution. I think Europe needs a new constitution. I think, and I understand why they say it, but I think Lee is saying that we cannot open up these treaties for renegotiation. They have to be opened up, because otherwise we can't create these sorts of institutions. Although you could create that presidency, by the way, without opening up the Lisbon Treaty, which is very interesting. You could do that. And then, once you put these things in place, what do you do with all of this? What does a Europe look like that is federal? Well, I would say that the number of competencies that you vest in those institutions, and that's something that will be democratically decided, you want as much competence vested, if you like, at the bottom of the pile, at the most local level possible, Cork City. Okay? And then you pass up competencies that you decide Cork City is not best placed to field. So Cork City is not going to do foreign policy, for example. You've got a very good foreign relations society, but I'm sure you're not going to open embassies for Cork. Maybe you would actually, but in Burkina Faso, for example. So we pass competencies up the ladder to the position closest to the citizen that it makes sense for them to be exercised. We have a strong union that is federal in structure. We have an elected president. We have a common foreign policy and all of the things that go with it, including a common defence. So I know that the neutrality debate here is something that tugs at lots of heartstrings. I've never entertained, we're not neutral because we can't defend ourselves. I mean, to be able to call yourself neutral, you have to be able to defend yourself. Ireland has no threats or overwhelming threats that we're aware of. I don't expect that we'll have any for a long time to come. But let's not kill ourselves. We can't defend ourselves. And if you are part of a family and you are prepared to sit around the dinner table every evening, and all of a sudden someone comes, whacking at the door with a baseball bat, I think the idea that you would say, well, actually, I'm neutral, so I'm not getting involved in this. I'm not going to defend the other members of my family. unless there's an immediate and present threat just to yourself, that's not on, it's not realistic and it's intellectually dishonest. I just thought I'd throw that out there because that's a real sore point, and I just want to be very honest in terms of my thinking on that. The single market, something that David Cameron talks about, something that Tories like to talk about in the UK, and they are right about that. There still is no real single market in Europe. There are still tariffs. They may not be called tariffs, but they're tariffs. There are still enormous barriers to being able to conduct true free trade across the European Union in goods, in all sorts of goods, in every type of good and in every type of service. The idea of state protection of industry is something, and this is what's called in Europe the social market economy, which I think is on the first page of the Lisbon Treaty, or the second page of the Lisbon Treaty, that we will build a social market economy, which sounds lovely, but it's not a market economy. A social market economy is a wonderful idea, but who decides what the social bit is? And that ends up being politicians, who under the current constructs are subject to the influence of powerful lobbies, and powerful lobbies get their way. And when powerful lobbies get their way, you see corruption in all sorts of forms take place. You see acts of utter madness, like the bailing out of industries whose bets have failed. Now, I'm a capitalist, and I'm an unapologetic capitalist, because I believe that that's the best way to help individuals, to give people the opportunity to be lifted up. And you know what? If they can't be lifted up for whatever reason, then you get in there and you get stuck in and you help them and you provide a safety net, and you have to do that. But you have to be able to free up and give people the opportunity to be able to try, fail, try again, and help them along every time. Europe, as it's constructed at the moment, has rewarded failure on a massive scale. So if you can fail to the tune of 50 or 100 billion, don't worry. We'll make all of you lot here pay for that entity's mistake, and they'll be able to carry on. Now, what that has done in Europe is it has so distorted competition and so tilted the playing field that it's very hard for entrepreneurs to be able to even see the sorts of opportunities that might otherwise exist. And it's certainly very difficult to be able to compete in the competition for access to capital. Because if capital is being transfused into the zombies of massive failed banks to the tune of tens and hundreds of billions of euro, that has a distorting effect in all sorts of ways. So you saw Peugeot, for example, get a bailout by the back door through its financing arm to the tune of over 7 billion in the last few weeks. This stuff has to stop. Because if you keep these zombies alive, the people in this room who may go out in the next few years and decide to set up the startup business that in a few years gets the opportunity to fill the space that one of these disappearing dinosaur industries creates, you're not going to be able to do that because the capital won't be available to you, and that dinosaur is still going to be there grazing away, kept alive by taxpayers' euros, transferred to them by politicians who have been captured, if you will, by the idea of propping up these things. So Europe is very dysfunctional in that sense. What are some dramatic but necessary solutions to address that issue? We need a pan-European, right across the federal Europe, a pan-European bankruptcy law. We need to be able to allow people to fail, learn from their mistakes, because those mistakes are costly, they cost money, they cost time. It was a learning and education process. We want those people to be able to have learned from that and to be able to try again. The idea that in some member states of Europe, you can be bankrupt for up to 12 years, that's been the case in Ireland for a very long time, is taking someone's most productive years away from them. If you're 25 or 26 and you first start up and belly up and you couldn't, you weren't able to make it, or you're 30, I mean, we don't send people to jail for that long for the most heinous crimes for 12 years. I mean, if we think in our criminal justice system that somebody can be transformed and can learn, having committed a heinous crime, and after 12 years is safe to be allowed back into society, are we seriously thinking that someone whose startup business failed and who needs a chance to be able to get going again isn't safe to be let out for 12 years under the bankruptcy process? That's stupid. I mean, these are skills that have cost these people and the people that provided them capital a lot of money. Let them out it, let them out again, and let them try and rebuild. So I would propose a 2-year maximum bankruptcy law, and maybe during the period of this crisis, which by the way is not over, and it's far from over, this is like sort of that bit in The Perfect Storm, you know, when the sky suddenly clears and they all think, oh, we're through, and then all of a sudden they realise they're just in the eye, and then they enter into the other side. That's where we are in this thing right now. Because the insolvency hasn't been closed out of the system, the hole is massive, we still don't know what is solvent and what isn't insolvent, because we're not doing what I'm explaining here. So create a 2-year bankruptcy process, purge the insolvency, don't pick winners. Alexander Hamilton saw one of his best friends go to debtor's prison in America. His name was William Drewer. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, the first Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He decided he wanted to build a bank. He set up a bank. It went wrong. He came to Hamilton, who was the Treasury Secretary, and basically said, I need a bailout. And Hamilton said, no. I like it, but I'm not going to do this. This is the people's money. And he went into bankruptcy, and at that time you ended up in debtor's prison, which was nuts, but you did. And William Drewer, his friend, died in debtor's prison, but Hamilton would not bail out his bank. Where are the Hamiltons of today? Where are the leaders of principle who will make a stand and do the right thing and not give in to the threats of a failed corporatist lobby and risk the whole of the European project on propping up businesses that need to be put through their insolvency process? Because that's what they've risked. They've risked the whole thing. This whole successful to date experiment for peace, prosperity, to create an example in the world is being risked by a corporatist lobby that is insolvent but that doesn't want to have to change the way that it operates. And that's crushing innovation, competitiveness and leadership in Europe right now. That has to stop. So the next European elections are certainly an opportunity to have this debate. Whether or not that opportunity will be exploited remains to be seen. I think that Barroso's call for parties running for the European election, or groups running for the European election, to name their nominee for the presidency of the Commission is a very good idea, because that will give at least some legitimacy to that individual, whoever that ends up being. But we need real pan-European political parties. I tried with Libertas, and that was an interesting experiment. It was quite a reconnaissance effort in finding out what you should and shouldn't do in trying to put that. I learned many lessons from that. But the key lesson that I learned is that actually it's possible. It could be done. It could be done. You have a system of political parties in every member state of the European Union that's sort of built on the model of the 19th century nation state that doesn't exist anywhere anymore. It's the ultimate legacy system. It's those political parties are the equivalent of those phones that you used to, go and wind up, and trying to pan and zoom on Google Earth over one of those phones. It's just absolutely unfit for the task. But it's going to be up to us to change that, because these political parties are not, I mean, with the best will in the world, they just can't do it. It's not set up for that. So it's an exciting time. I think Europe, as I said, is capable of a new renaissance. We have to stop picking winners. We have to provide opportunity and equality of opportunity to every single citizen of the European Union. We have to be open to new ideas. We have to have the courage and the vision to be able to create new democratic accountable institutions, and we need to learn what federalism is and the bottom-up nature of federalism. It is not about giving power to the centre. I would resist such a move with every iota. I would be utterly opposed to it. But that is not what a federal Europe is. So I'll open it up to the floor for questions.